Hi, my name is Ying Hui and I am the sub-regional researcher for this topic on SDGs, human rights and civic space in Southeast Asia. The first section is the state and trends of these SDGs in Southeast Asia. Before the comparison is being made, it is essential first to understand the context of each country in the Southeast Asia region. Southeast Asia is a highly diverse region consisting of 11 countries that occupy roughly 4.5 million square kilometers of land. The sub-region includes Indonesia, one of the world's biggest countries in terms of populations and land area, and Brunei, Singapore, and Timor-Leste, the three of the tiniest island states in terms of the land area and population. The 11 countries are highly diverse with a mixtures of democratic and authoritarian rule with the different economic levels. So the categorizations of countries are being grouped in three. First is referring to the developed countries, Brunei and Singapore. Second, middle income countries referring to Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam. And third category is the developing countries referring to Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Timor-Leste. If we look at it, these 11 countries are also diverse in terms of their size and sustainable development priorities and outcome. Income and wealth are also different, whereby you have Brunei and Singapore being among the two of the wealthiest in the world, and we also have the world's poorest, referring to Cambodia, Myanmar, and Timor-Leste, using the World Bank 2020 GDP per capita. Now we move on to the national implementation of the SDGs. If you look at the slides here, 7 countries adopted the SDGs at the national level as early as 2016 when it was first introduced. The countries are Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Philippines, and Singapore. Thailand, Vietnam, and Timor-Leste adopted the national SDGs in 2017, with Myanmar as the last country to adopt the national SDGs in 2018. Most countries somehow have assimilated the SDGs in their development plans, accessed their indicator systems, and formulated their implementation plans for achieving the SDGs. We look at the Myanmar, they have divided the 17 goals and put it narrow down and make it as 5 here, with goal 1 on peace, national reconciliation, and the second goal being the economic stability, the third being the job creation, goal 4 human resources, and the 5th goal is natural resources. As for the countries Cambodia and Laos, they have added SDG 18 on the issues of landmines. These slides also show you the national plan on SDGs that I have just briefly mentioned, in which the 11 countries have integrated the SDGs into their national plans. Looking at the VNR reports here, thus far, all countries have submitted the VNR report except Myanmar, that is scheduled to actually provided the report in 2021, but it did not take place because of the political situation in the countries. Looking at this chart, Indonesia has thus the countries that has submitted actually 3 VNR report and being very consistent. Nevertheless, such a review somehow, although it reflects the country's commitment to SDG, but it should not be considered the same as its effectiveness in implementation. This is because the preparation of the VNR report can be driven not only by internally, but also externally, with the assistance coming from international actors and so forth. Moreover, the statistic alone that coming from the national level can sometimes and somehow be disputed. A few countries have taken steps into the localization of the SDGs, and we can see in this slide the countries such as Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Philippines, and also Vietnam. Interestingly, for countries, the wealthiest countries in this sub-region, referring to Brunei and Singapore, the focus on SDG is not as high as the other countries. Now let's move on to the SDSN SDG Index 2016 to 2021. So across the regions, we observe the different ranking and performance of the Southeast Asian countries, and SDG scores of Malaysia and Thailand have been somewhat consistent between 60% to 75%. Indonesia and Philippines are both between 50% to 70%. For Cambodia, Myanmar and Laos, their rankings have been relatively consistent at between 40% to 65%. Singapore is an interesting case where the ranking gap was pretty wide between 19 in 2016 to 93 in 2020 and 76 in 2021. But of course, back then in 2016 and 2017, the countries that are involved with the index are much lesser. Nevertheless, it has somehow shown a decrease in its performance. Vietnam is the only country that has shown positive progress, where its ranking increased from 88 in 2016 to 649 in 2020, with a slight decrease in 2021 to 51. But overall, most of the countries' ranking and performance witness a zigzag pattern. As the data shown, you will notice that the data for Brunei and Timor-Leste, the data is not consistent. Now we will zoom into the SDGs 5, 10, and 16. SDG 5 referring to the gender equality, SDG 10 referring to the inequality, and SDG 16 referring to the peace and justice and strong institutions. On SDGs SDG 5, 6, 10, and 16, it is being separated between two slides here, between the countries. Yeah, so you can see from the first slide, it's referring to the Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Philippines, Singapore, Malaysia, and Myanmar. And if you look at the chart, you will notice that the information, especially for Brunei, is not completed comparing to the other regions. And the same thing also goes for the Timor-Leste in some of the data. So on SDG 5, Singapore is the one that has witnessed a moderate increase in 2021, as we can see from this slide. Vietnam is considered as well been doing quite well comparing to the other countries when it comes to the SDGs 5. Moving into the SDG 10, it is interesting that to witness, to look at the statistic coming from Brunei and Singapore, despite being the two most developed countries in the Southeast Asia, their data in the SDG 10 is incomplete somehow, especially for Brunei. And also the performance is not as favorable as it's supposed to be. For the SDG 16, as we can see here, Timor-Leste thus far has been doing pretty well comparing to the countries here, as you can see from the slide, Vietnam and Thailand. Nevertheless, it is once more times when it comes to Brunei, the data is not available for SDG 16. But overall, most of the countries witness the stagnant and situation with the significant challenges remain. And with some of the countries remain moderate increases. Here is the SDGs 5, 10, and 16, the score that is different on a separate way, where you can see the Timor-Leste and Brunei, again, there is no data available for most of the years, while the other countries are shown in this slide. Now let's us moving on to the human rights commitments in Southeast Asia, looking at the UPR SDGs as well as the special procedures. So the 11 countries have different records when it comes to human rights commitments, as you can see from this slide. Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Thailand are the 4 countries that have been elected to the UN Human Rights Council. And the Philippines was elected 5 times and Indonesia 4 times, where Malaysia has been elected 3 times actually. So when this slide is being made, it has not been including with the recent, the most recent elections that put Malaysia's being elected for the 3rd times for 2022 to 2024. Thailand was in the UN Human Rights Council once in 2011 to 2013. There are 6 NHRIs here in the Southeast Asia region, namely the Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, Myanmar, and Timor-Leste. All are accredited A status, except Thailand and Myanmar in B status. The explanation is quite direct, where it is related to the current political situation in both countries with strong military influence. When it comes to the international human rights treaties, the pattern is interesting because the number of treaties being ratified in the Southeast Asia region does not translate directly into the existing human rights commitment. Cambodia, Indonesia, and the Philippines are the countries that ratified the most international human rights treaties with a record of 8 out of 9. Laos, Timor-Leste, and Vietnam ratified 7 out of 9. Thailand has ratified 6, while Singapore and Myanmar ratified 4. Malaysia ratified 3, with Brunei ratified only 2, sorry. All 11 Southeast Asian countries ratified both CRC and CEDAW. As to the CRPD, all countries ratified it except Timor-Leste. CED is the least popular human rights treaties among the 11 countries. Here is the UN Special Procedures and the Southeast Asia Record. But I will first go for the UPR recommendations and the links to SDGs by using the cycle 2 and the cycle 3. So looking at these 2 cycles and the top 5 SDG goals that match with the UPR. So how we can see is that the data for the top 5 SDGs in the UPR recommendation is rather interesting in Southeast Asia, as SDG 16 is the top 1 SDG for all Southeast Asian countries except Timor-Leste, where SDG 16 is rated as a top 2, with its top 1 being the SDG 5 on gender equality. However, if we look at the top 2, the 3 countries scored SDG 8 on decent work and economic growth, namely Singapore, Thailand, and Brunei. The 3rd popular SDG among the Southeast Asian country is SDG 5 and also SDG 8. The 4th popular is SDG 3, followed by the SDG 5, and the 5th popular SDG, that means the least popular, is SDG 10, reduce inequality. The data on the top 5 SDGs in the UPR recommendation here somehow reveals the discrepancy between the data and the analysis on trends using the SDSN Sustainable Development Goals. So SDG 5 and 10 are somehow among the 2 SDGs that most countries do not get a good review and rating, yet their acceptance in the UPR is relatively significant. When we look at the special repertoire, it is not so much of a popular mechanism that being used in the Southeast Asia, where only Malaysia and Timor-Leste have the record of extending the invitation to the special procedures. Cambodia and Myanmar both have a record of special procedures in their countries. So looking at the data of the 3 latest special procedures to the Southeast Asian countries, most of the accepted invitations are related to economic, social, and cultural rights. For instance, food, health, and extreme poverty. Now let's move on to section 2 on state and trends of COVID-19 in Southeast Asia. So if we look at this chart as of 1st October 2021 from the worldometers.info, interesting thing is that there are 677 million population in the 11 Southeast Asian countries with, we have the highly populated countries such as Indonesia, and we also have the tiny countries such as Brunei, Timor-Leste, and Singapore. How do we then see the population size in response to the region's COVID-19 cases vaccine rate and the death cases. So based on the number of cases as of 1st October 2021, as you can see from this slide, Malaysia is ranked the highest at 75. Its cases per million are far higher than the other 10 Southeast Asian countries. The other 10 Southeast Asian countries are ranked between 133 to 173, with Laos considered the lowest ranking. This data also corresponds with the number of deaths per million, where Malaysia's continue to rank the highest at 84, whereby Singapore ranked the lowest at 192. This corresponds to many reports about the better healthcare system being put in place in Singapore. The records of both countries, such as Philippines and Myanmar, where they are both ranked the second and the third highest at 121 and 122 during the COVID-19, have shown the signs of tension when it comes to coping with the increased cases with the inadequate health facilities. Moving on to these slides by using the Johns Hopkins University's data via the CSIS. The data here shown that only 4 countries in the Southeast Asia have achieved more than 50% of the vaccination rate. They are Singapore, Cambodia, Brunei, and Malaysia. Singapore is the country that has provided vaccination at the highest rate at 83.3%. Cambodia follows this at 77.7%, then Malaysia at 70.6%. While the Brunei has achieved 52.3. Countries with a lower vaccination rate are Thailand at 36, Laos at 31.8, Timor-Leste at 23.5, Indonesia and Philippines both at 22.9, Vietnam at 18, and Myanmar at the lowest of 7.3%. Realizing the importance of create herd immunity, a few countries have increased the vaccination program, looking especially for those who are still achieve the low vaccination rate. However, the surge of the COVID-19 and in the cases have also, one of the factors is driven by the Delta variant, which reached across the Southeast Asia, and thus far as the virus spreads from cities to regional and rural areas, and I think the vaccination program is intensified, and while they're still dealing with many resistance in terms of getting vaccinations coming from the people. How do we see then when it comes to the mortality rate? So Malaysia, as you can see from this slide, has the highest mortality rate per million, and followed by Indonesia and the Philippines. What are the impacts of COVID-19 on democracy and human rights? In this section, this presentation use the ideas GSOD indexes referring to the global state of democracy, where in this index, they have divided the democracy to high performance, mid-range performance, and a weak or low performance, while the hybrid is referring to Singapore here, as you can see from the slide, and the authoritarian regime. There are 4 countries here with Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and Vietnam. With Brunei, no data available. Overall, Laos is the country that most concerning as well when it comes to the indexes, when it comes to the low performance, as well as the follow-up by Cambodia under these 5 sections on representative government, fundamental rights, check on governments, impartial administration, as well as the participatory engagements. So the yellow here means most of the countries that have achieved is of the mid-range performance. As for the green is a high performance, where we only witness it in the Timor-Leste when it comes to representative governments, in which this directly reflect to the multi-party election systems that Timor-Leste practice. And as for the Singapore, has achieved the high performance when it comes to impartial administration in terms of its governance. So what then are the impact of COVID-19 on democracy and human rights in the regions. Thus far, what it can be summarized is that most containment measures in this sub-region have been enacted under existing national disaster management or public health emergency legislations without necessarily a specific reference to human rights or the scrutiny required for the official declaration of a state of emergency. So in some certain cases, there have been rising of the concerns when it comes to legislations that dealing with the so-called fake news, misinformation, disinformations that are being used to curb the political dissidents in the regions. So there are a few observations here where it involves the defamations and criminalizations of human rights defenders and democracy advocates under the name of the COVID-19. There's also the concerns about the arbitrary applications of the rule of law principle under the state of emergencies when it comes to the freedom of assemblies, freedom of expression and so forth. So what COVID-19 show in this when it comes to the impacts on democracy and human rights is that the correlation between the economy and the perception of democracy cannot be ignored, as there is no direct causal analysis between the two. Later on, moving to section 3 here, state and trends on democracy and civic space, which is closely linked with the section 2, will show how the statistic alone does not really reflect on how is the situation of a country managing the COVID-19 and also how the situation of the civic space. In these sections, it is divided to the Democracy Index, Civic Space Index, as well as the Pre-Freedom Index. So for the Democracy Index, it is using the EIU Index, where as you can see from 2016 to 2020, of the 11 Southeast Asian countries here, looking at the patterns here, so Timor-Leste is considered the highest ranking among 11 countries, followed by the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and Thailand. They achieve a rank of below 100. And the other 4 countries, namely Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam, have above 130 in 2020. So looking at the trend here, only Malaysia have actually achieved some progressing trend, where this is contributed to the political change in the country since 2016, where it experiences the improvement in its democracy, especially after a peaceful regime change in 2018. Nevertheless, the situation in the later on might be a little bit different, where Malaysia continues to be challenge in terms of its political stability. But overall, it is observed that the trends are of zigzag pattern for other countries between 2016 to 2020. All countries, however, experience a decreasing trend in democracy from 2019 to 2020, with Singapore as the only country that moved up one place. Nevertheless, it is not significant to praise for Southeast Asia's ranking in the Democracy Index. Closely linked and corresponds with the Civic space monitor as well. So as we can see here, Southeast Asian countries have experienced a broad and continued contractions of the political space and civil liberties over the past years generally. So from the civic space monitors, they have divided the categories to open, narrowed, obstructed, repressed, and closed. So for the 11 countries, no countries fall under the category of open or narrow, with all the 11 countries are either obstructed, repressed, and closed. This reflected the concerning situation of civic space in the Southeast Asian region. And this is coincide with the data from EIU Democracy Index, where both Laos and Vietnam have been in the category of closed since 2017. Thailand, Myanmar, and Cambodia are the 3 countries under the category of repressed since 2017 without changes. As to Singapore, Timor-Leste, Malaysia, and Indonesia, the 4 countries have been in the category of obstructed since 2017. For the Philippines, it was under the category of obstructed from 2017 to 2019. However, it was now graded to in 2020 due to the vilification of activists and targeting of human rights defenders and journalists. And Brunei has been in the category of obstructed in 2017 to 2018. The downgrade happens use the index by RSF. Apart from the Timor-Leste, the rank for the other 10 countries is above 100, where it is observed that the Indonesia has a positive trend in its press freedom from 2017 to 2021 with a steady improvement from 124 to 113. Malaysia is observed to have improved as well as coincide with the corresponds with the EIU Democracy Index and the Civic space as well, where due to the political change in the country. Press freedom in Southeast Asia countries is considered as a significant issue where you have Cambodia, Laos, the Philippines, Singapore, and the Myanmar experience a downward trend. So generally, looking at the three different indexes, the EIU Democracy Index, Press Freedom, and the Civicus related to civic space on issues such as freedom of assembly, freedom of movements and expression have generally to show that the response to and the management of COVID-19 across Southeast Asia has varied, and it does not correlate directly to how democratic or how open the country is. Almost all countries in this region experience government that are increasingly assertive in showing authoritarian governance. Moving on to section 4 on state and challenges of Southeast Asian at CSO international engagement and advocacy. The first section is CSO engagement with the sub-regional multi-stakeholder forum on SDGs, where there are two platforms that are being examined here. First is the sub-regional SDG forum, and the second is the ASEAN Civil Society Conference or ASEAN People's Forum, ACSC/APF. So the sub-regional SDG forums comes with the under the UN SCAP and partners from within and outside the UN system. Basically on SDGs, these forums aims to strengthen SDG implementation at the national and sub-regional levels, where it has three aims. That is the first, to share sub-regional perspectives, second, discuss collaborative measures, and third, to exchange the good practices. So what happened was that the discussions that are being discussed here is being fit into the regional and global processes, including the Asia Pacific Forum for Sustainable Development, APFSD, as well as the high-level political forum. And also it is being used to assist the member states within the with their VNR reporting. And the second platform, the ACSC APF, is solely by the civil society, where what is being used, it is generally started in 2005 in Malaysia. And in terms of its structure, it is held independently by the ASEAN chair country in advance of and parallel to the ASEAN summit. It is necessary to note that although Timor-Leste is not a part of ASEAN, but ACSC/APF also apply the inclusivity, whereby they include Timor-Leste in their programs. So ACSC APF basically is a platform for civil society and individuals to share their concerns on the regional and national issues that impact people's lives and strengthen their voices on social political issues. Its thematic priorities are cutting across the years, are normally on human rights, social protection, foreign policies, trade and investments, labor and migration, social inequalities, peace and security, food sovereignty, women, gender, LGBTs, and climate justice, and so forth. And it actually just had their 2021 annual meeting on 15 to 17 October under the topic of authoritarianism, militarism, and COVID-19 challenges for collective actions to address rising inequality and shrinking civic space in Southeast Asia. So what happened was that the ACSC APF while it's a champion on the democracy and human rights issues, the language of the SDGs continues to be a little bit lacking. However, this is mainly part of it is due to the skepticisms by the civil societies on how their governments have been fed when it comes to the SDGs as well as their commitments. And the skepticism also increased coming from the data by their national governments that can be disputed. The second part of it is the ASEAN. So when we look at the ASEAN components, there are a few CSO platforms. For instance, ASEAN Summit, that is linked with the ACSC that I mentioned just now, ASEAN Ministerial Meetings, ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, AICHA, ASEAN Commission on the Promotion and Protection of the Rights of Women and Children, ASEAN Forum on Migrant Labor, and so forth. Thus far, AICHA is one of the most active one when it comes to incorporate the CSO into the language of the SDGs. Nevertheless, one of the weakness remains to be CSO to have must have the consultative relationship with the AICHA in order to be within the platform. So overall, looking at the CSO engagement on SDGs in this sub-region in Southeast Asia, there are still a lot of rooms to improve. Here comes to my conclusion. So in conclusions, statistics alone do not reflect 100% of the situation happening on the ground as we witness from, as I elaborated from section 1 to section 4. While the financing resources, weak capacity, inadequate mechanism among the challenges that are often cited as one of the primary concerns of SDG implementation, this cannot be considered the same for all Southeast Asian countries, because there are some who have more capacities and financial resources. Nevertheless, it comes down to the political will of the Southeast Asian governments to actually be more inclusive and under the spirit of the multi-stakeholders. So what we can see here is that the recommendations. So I'll conclude my presentations with two parts of the recommendation. First part is the recommendation to governments. Recommendation on SDG, there are 6 here. The first, mobilizing financing for SDG achievement. Second, enhance innovation and technological capacity. Third, improve planning and policy coherence. Fourth, promote genuine partnership. Fifth, use justice to rebuild economies. And sixth is to remove bureaucratic hurdles. Recommendation on COVID-19, there are 7 here. Embed long-term inclusivity in recovery packages, prioritizing bridging the digital divide, green the economy, structural and systematic changes, accessibility to vaccines should be ensured for all, develop national inequality reduction plans, and prioritize gender and intersectional inequality, invest public health as a basic human rights. And a recommendation on democracy and civic space, there are 5 here on basically about create a friendly environments and also to recognize the importance of the universality of the human rights. Recommendation on international engagement, there are 4 here, and generally it is about the importance of activate and the multilateral dialogue and partnership within and beyond the region as well, and to strengthen the involvement of the civil society participation. And here is note that I must mention that the recommendations that are being put forward here are gathered from the different reports from the organization working on SDGs. For instance, the declaration of the 2021 Global People's Assembly, C20 policy, pact on G20, UN 75, Kathmandu Declaration, Declaration of SDG 16+, and so forth. And the last part is the recommendations to CSO here, and there are 5 strategies here. First is strategies in changing human rights narrative. Second, innovation in daily operations and financial sustainabilities, utilize technologies, foster the networks among the CSOs, as well as the empowerment of the regional as CSO towards the local and national as CSOs. So here, that's all for my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.